Everybody to this afternoon's session on opening access to research data, empowering researchers to operationalise open access policies and strategies. Our speaker for this session is Dr. Leanne Wiseman. Dr. Wiseman is Associate Professor in the Griffith Law School at Griffith University in Brisbane in Australia. She researches and publishes in the field of intellectual property law with a particular focus on copyright and the role that it plays in the dissemination of information. She's currently researching into open access and licensing issues. Would you please welcome Dr. Leanne Wiseman?
Hi, everyone. I'd like to actually acknowledge Jay, my co-author. He got the short straw. He's teaching up on the Sunshine Coast, and I get to come to this beautiful city. But we've been doing some work in this area for some time, so we just wanted to speak to you today about some observations we've drawn from the work that we are currently doing on open access research in agricultural spheres and some of the perhaps the observations that we can bring across into the higher education sector. So it's almost 25 years since open access has gained the momentum since the Budapest and Berlin declarations, and it was really at that time that there was a seminal shift in public institutions' attitudes towards the benefits of opening access to research. So essentially what we've seen since that time is hundreds and hundreds of mandates, policies, public declarations around open access and opening of research and opening of data. What essentially these statements are high-level, top-down declarations around opening and access and what the benefits of that would be for organisations. So among the kind of plethora of policies and guidelines, what we often hear about is that law is one of the biggest hurdles, if you like, to opening access, and that it will be the intellectual property rights or the confidentiality or the privacy rights that are the reasons why information can't be made free, essentially. Now, in September 2016, we saw essentially a very clear, probably a useful, clear guidance and mandate principles, if you like, that were released by the Research Data Alliance and the Committee of Data on the International Council of Science, so RDA and CODATA, for those of you who are familiar with it. They had a working group looking at legal interoperability guidelines and how to remove the legal barriers to opening up access to research and data. What they observed in their working party group was that while many of the open access mandates and policy statements focus on the value of openness, many of them don't actually deal with the legal conditions that are required for the interoperability. So legal interoperability is one of the fundamental premises, if you like, that we need to kind of push forward to make sure that researchers are comfortable with their agreements to release their data and research as they may be required to. What these principles are, and these are put very simply, the guidelines and documents itself is quite detailed, but put simply, these are the legal interoperability guidelines. Firstly, to facilitate the lawful access and reuse of research data, to determine the rights and responsibilities for that data, to balance any legal interests, to state the rights transparently and clearly, to promote the harmonisation of rights in research data, and also to provide attribution and credit for the research data. Now, each and every one of those I could speak on at full length. For example, issues about who owns the data. That's one of the issues as we travel around Australia speaking to farmers and growers and producers and agribusinesses. Everybody wants to know who owns the data because it's seen as a valuable, that is where the value lies, and whoever owns it controls it, essentially. So if you have a look at these principles, when you have a look at them and read them, are they really helpful to a researcher when it comes down to navigating the open access landscape? To be honest, I'm a lawyer, I'm an IP lawyer and also a copyright lawyer. I don't know that my colleagues working in research would necessarily find those particularly helpful. So what I wanted to do, rather than spend the time and delve into each of these principles and the issues of legal interoperability, which I'm more than happy to speak to you about over drinks tonight, what I wanted to do is just take an example of two large agricultural funding organisations that we have been doing work with and around, and look at the way that they have operationalised their open access mandates and policies and what this has meant for researchers. We've chosen two, and that's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and also the CGIAR, and I'll explain that just in a little bit. We know that the Wellcome Foundation has also taken kind of seminal steps in relation to platform development for researchers, but because they're in the biomedical field, I just wanted to concentrate today on the agricultural sphere. When we're looking at agricultural funding for research, we're essentially looking at food security. So we're looking at attempts by organisations such as Bill and Melinda Gates to make every human life a better life and the best life that it can be. So we're talking at very fundamental primary research materials. And both these organisations are aimed at developing, their research and funding is aimed at providing assistance in developing nations, so small lot farm holders in Africa and India who would benefit most probably from more information being made available to them. So what happened? Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2014 basically set up a mandate that they would adopt an open access policy, and this is essentially just some of the social media response to the mandate that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, once they announce it, that all research that they fund would become publicly available for free. And it's overwhelmingly positive. It was held to be a role model for all research funding organisations as to how all research funders should go ahead with the open access mandates, for example. So they passed an open access policy in 2014 that came into operation on the 1st of January 2015. And it had a 2-year transition period. So in January 2017, this year, the transitional period expired. So that policy now is in place and it's mandatory for all research that is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to be made openly accessible, free. It must be available for reuse for either non-commercial or commercial purposes. So there should be no restriction whatsoever. Interestingly, I'll take you through, basically, if you received funding from Gates post-2005, this is essentially the clause in your contract, your research contract. So if you seek publication of funded developments in a peer-reviewed journal, it must be under open access terms and conditions that's consistent with the Foundation's open access policy, and it gives you the link, and it must be, they're able to update it from time to time, which is not unusual when we look at contractual clauses. So the 5 key elements of the Gates Foundation and how they're examining their and implementing their open access policy are essentially put down to those 5 key elements. That is, all publications must be openly accessible, and that means discoverable and accessible online. They must be on open access terms, such as the CC BY licence. It must be open immediately, and no embargo periods are acceptable once that transition period has expired in January this year. All underlying data must also be accessible and open immediately. What's important about the Gates approach is that the Foundation has agreed to pay all reasonable article processing fees. So the Foundation itself precludes those amounts to be put in research budgets because they will not fund it, but they themselves have agreed to pay those article processing fees, and they've broken down the amount as to what's a reasonable cost and expense. To facilitate their open access policy, they basically consulted widely with their researchers and the individual scholars who actually were funded by Gates about the frustrations that researchers often have with open access mandates and policies. Inevitably, top-down policy comes down to researchers, and yet it's just another thing that we have to do. And as with all essentially developments that are occurring in the learning and teaching space as well, there is a never-ending shift, if you like, of new policies that the academics are feeling that they're just, you say, cascading upon us. We cannot escape. So what Gates did in July 2016, so this is midway through their transitional period, they developed a platform. It's known as Kronos, and it's a bespoke platform that they have developed to assist Gates-funded researchers with opening access to their research and their underlying data. If you have a look at the front screen, essentially, once you receive Gates funding, you'll get an email with a password that will give you access to the Kronos system. Unfortunately, as you can see, I don't have any Gates funding. Otherwise, I could take you through that, but I can't. So it's only Gates funders who can to go into that system. But basically, if we look at how that system works, that system is really a one-stop shop for the researcher. Once you have your journal publication, you can submit it basically into your into the Kronos system. You can search for open access compliant journals. You can filter all your search results by price or the impact factor. So there's actually quite a sophisticated search mechanism. You can, when you're ready to submit, you submit your publication directly into Kronos, and that then connects to the journal's publications website. So you go through Kronos into, for example, Elsevier. Then you get subjected to the Elsevier peer review process or whatever normal process that occurs. If there is an open access fee, an article processing fee, that will automatically be paid through the Kronos system at that time. And then at the end, the individual researcher and the Gates Foundation themselves will get a report that generates data around the impact of the journal, where it's been published. It also gives information on compliance, anything that they basically want. It's generated in a report, both for the Gates Foundation, who can then close the loop in terms of compliance, the big C word, but also for the individual can see where their research has been cited and the reports, etc. So basically, as you'll see, this is a Gates slide that basically outlines the process by which, so you activate your account and then you can submit your publication. So the interesting thing about Kronos is that Gates have been very influential in getting a number of high-profile and proprietary journals on board. They have a 2-year contract that they've signed with Reed Elsevier in terms of the publication. They've got the American Association of Sciences on board, and they are continuing a conversation with publishers to bring them on board into the Kronos system. Publishers obviously love it because they are guaranteed payment of their article processing fee as well. So it's a win-win, essentially. And obviously, the Gates Foundation is in a financial position to support this. And that is, the dollar figure is always something that's worthy of attention. So just before I move on to the other organisation I looked at, when dealing with gates, they have recognised that this is at early stages. So it's only been since July last year that Chronos has been in operation. They have recognised that there are some limitations around Chronos. For example, when we're talking about open access, one of the things that is often not spoken about, there seems to be an assumption that if you're making publications open access, that the language of choice will be English. Now, when you are funding research for developing nations, as Gates does, English is not the language that's spoken in most of those countries. So the questions, and Gates are engaging in conversation around, perhaps would they pay translation fees for articles to be translated into the country of origin's language, for example, which would then ensure that the research reaches the ultimate recipient in terms of their end impact. Both the Gates Foundation and CGIAR are very interesting in the way that neither organisation really cares about how the information gets out there. Both of their kind of modus operandi is to ensure that the research has the impact that it is intended to have, that it gets to where it needs to be, and in a way that it can be digested and used and reused, for example. The other organisation, just to make a comparison, or the other issue with Gates to think about is Gates are also looking at following up with data, so that at the moment they've focused on publications and proprietary journals, but they are intending to move towards opening data and how they're going to manage that. The data, although they've mandated that the data, how Chronos can actually be developed to deal with data. Also, they've recognised that institutions such as universities and research organisations may want to have an institutional membership of Chronos, for example. And that's something that they're open to, but it's just, they have admitted that it's essentially early days for them. So it's only really 6-8 months that Chronos has been operating. So I think there's further work to be done. And they're certainly open to engagement from researchers as to how that system of Chronos can be improved. Now, CGIAR is a UN body formerly known as a Consortium of International Agricultural Research Centres. It's not known as that anymore. It's known as its acronym of CGIAR. It is basically the largest publicly funded agricultural research organisation in the world. It has 15 research centres across the world, and they are all in developing nations. So they focus on, we have World Fish in Penang, we have the Rice Institute, we have maize, we have dry land crops, forestry, meat and livestock, etc. So there's essentially 8,000 research scientists within the CGIAR centres, and they have essentially about an $800 million research budget. Now, CGIAR, one of the large funders of CGIAR are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, along with many other philanthropic funders. But basically, a lot of pressure from Gates was brought on CGIAR to actually bring their research, publicly funded research must be available to the public at no charge, no cost. So in 2012, there was a general shift within the CGIAR organisation to move towards free and open access of all of their research results and development activities. They adopted what they know as the intellectual assets, or the principles for the management of intellectual assets. And I just want to highlight the way that the CGIAR look at information and research, because it's a little bit unusual compared to the traditional way that most people view research. A lot of people view research outcomes as being potential intellectual property, but we all know that data and raw data falls outside the scope of intellectual property. It's not protected, so you can't own raw data in that sense. So their intellectual assets principles basically reinforce the concept of they want to make their knowledge travel. So when they talk about that, they talk about, or they've developed what they call the AAA framework, and that is that the information and research must be available, so people must be able to find it, accessible, people must be able to put their hands on it, and also applicable in terms of they must be able to use it and reuse it, which is important. Just to highlight the intellectual asset definition that they've developed in their overarching principles, if you have a look at the way they define intellectual assets, they don't talk about intellectual property. We know intellectual property is about copyright, patents, trademarks, confidential information, designs. But they talk about intellectual assets, and just so you can get the sense of the breadth of what they're talking about, have a read of that definition. What's important about that is any results or product of research or development activities. So that may be knowledge. Now that's not a form of intellectual property, we know. Germplasm technologies, know-how. Know-how is another example of things, of something that falls below the threshold of protection within intellectual property. If you have a look at that definition, that would cover data. And data, we know raw data, is not covered by our Western concept of intellectual property. So they have defined how they deal with their intellectual assets as being everything. It will be a video, it will be a cartoon, it will be a graphic, a design, whatever. It doesn't need to be an information product that's protected by intellectual property, which is the way that a lot of open access policies are really drafted. So Article 6.1 of the IA principles, this is the nub of their open access policy, basically, that the consortium and its centres shall promptly and broadly disseminate the research results subject to confidentiality and subject to any limited delays to seek IP rights. Something about the CGIAR that's important is they don't necessarily see intellectual property as a barrier to open access, and that is often how it's posed. What they see intellectual property rights is essentially two sides of the same coin. If their goal is to get the information out into the communities and for that information to be used, sometimes an intellectual property right is the means by which they can do that. If you take out a patent over certain information and release it into a country, that will prevent others from locking that information up. That's an interesting observation when you look at the Gates Foundation. They're happy everything has to be open and someone can use that information or research for commercial purposes. So you've got the opportunity then to lock that information back up into a product and then it gets commercialised. So the ultimate goal of open access seems to get a little bit lost in that translation. So CGIAR do recognise that IP rights can sometimes assist. So they listen to the concerns of researchers and basically set up a whole host of support tools for researchers. Again, once again, they see that the researchers, they had a whole lot of problems. They've got 15 international research centres in developing nations. So basic infrastructure across the CGIAR is very disparate. We're talking different languages, we're talking different data sets, different architecture. So there was no uniformity in terms of CGIAR research centres. So there was a lot of concern about how the researchers were going to comply with this opening up of their research and to ensure that their information was out there. CGIAR do a lot of training and education, and that's been my relationship with them in terms of webinars and training around intellectual property, developing support tools for researchers, addendums for publishers' agreements, FAQs, guidelines on which license to suggest, etc. So this is very similar to what we heard before with Adele's speech about the great work that University of Sydney is doing in terms of your open data policy with researchers, giving them the tools that they need to make sure that their research is open. So you can have a look at both the Gates and the CGIAR website, but there's basically a whole host of information that's free and out there, and they continually have open data and open publication workshops twice a year in one of the different international research centres. What I just wanted to draw some basically observations for us in higher education is that we've seen two large organisations approach the operationalising of open access in different ways. As a researcher within a university, our experience, and I speak on behalf of some of the colleagues of mine, we're in humanities, but it's certainly the experience of our colleagues in the sciences as well, is that there seems to be a disconnect between our Office of Research and our library. Our library is fantastic in that they will chase your publications and make sure that they're out there. But if we get a $3 million grant from the Australian government that requires, as we know, for example, the Australian Research Council requires that all of our publications and data becomes openly available, that goes through the Office of Research. They worry about contracts, etc. But no one then at that stage talked to researchers about open access, where you're going to publish, where's your data going to be. You get right through the 5-year project if it's a laureate, for example, and at the end you have to do your final report and you do that, and no one really cares. The ARC has never really knocked on anyone's doors and said, oh, by the way, your 5 years of ARC funding, we don't know where it is. And we're talking about laureate grants that are on food security that are supposed to change the world for us, and nobody knows where their stuff is. So we've got the library over here working really hard, but then we've got the Office of Research, often, apart from the University of Sydney. So in terms of the way, I think, it was really just an observation, in terms of the way I think we need to think about our research ecosystems within universities, is that there needs to be a conversation at the start, similar to intellectual property. If you're going to use an e-notebook or whatever, you have to be having thoughts around what is your end goal. When you design your project, you know essentially where you want to be. You need to be thinking about your data, you need to be thinking about your publication. But in terms of most of our funding mandates now do demand open access in terms of publication and data. And how is that circle being closed within the institutions that we work in? Just some thoughts. And that's really over to you. Thank you.
We do have some time for questions, just a couple of minutes if anyone has any. And I'll just check the online questions, see if they come through. Are there any questions? Yes, there are. Good. We'll take these two to start with.
Thanks, Leanne. I enjoyed your talk. With the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they pay for the gold access, for the open access.
Yes.
Do they have some sort of influence on the selection or the available journals that they would direct researchers to publish in? Do they make recommendations saying, these particular journals will waive fees should you publish in them? These ones that we don't have a special relationship with, we will pay for them later. I mean, do they put some sort of strictures on there? Because that will also have an effect on the ranking of the paper and how that's actually reported back to the RAs.
Yes. Originally, from the conversations I've had with their open access officers, essentially they went through and looked at the journals that ticked the boxes for their open access policy. And then those journals became simply come down in the drop-down box that when you go to, you can basically click on your journal. But they are going ahead then and contracting, as they've done with Elsevier for 2 years, to bring all the Elsevier journals in. So they are approaching publishers to bring new publishers into the fold. And they're, as we've seen, they're very successful. It's a big organisation. And publishers are quite happy to sign up, as I said, Elsevier for 2 years to see they have a guarantee of their payments.